She walked into a Seattle courtroom completely alone. No lawyer, no money, no voice anyone intended to hear. Across the room, the man who once promised to protect her sat smiling, confident, untouchable, certain he had already won. But what he didn't know was that someone was watching from the shadows, and that the only witness who never lied was a German shepherd waiting behind a locked door. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Seattle woke beneath a sky the color of worn steel. Rain slid down glass towers and pooled along the streets like something alive, restless, tapping at boots and tires with quiet persistence. The city smelled of wet asphalt and pine carried down from the hills, sharp and clean and unforgiving. In winter, Seattle did not shout its cruelty. It whispered it, slowly, until you felt smaller without ever knowing exactly when it began. The King County Family Courthouse rose from the gray like a block of conscience carved from stone. Its steps were slick with rain, its doors tall and indifferent, swallowing people whole without ceremony. By the time Wren Hartley reached the top step, the hem of her navy coat was damp and heavy, clinging to her calves like it wanted to pull her back down. She paused there, not because she was afraid, but because she needed one breath where the world was still hers. Wren was 34, slender in a way that came not from fragility, but from endurance. She stood just under 5'7", with narrow shoulders that carried more weight than they looked capable of bearing. Her hair, once worn loose and chestnut bright, was now pulled into a low knot at the base of her neck, streaked with faint strands of premature silver that appeared during the last 2 years of her marriage. Her skin was pale, not sickly, but winter-worn, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to make herself small indoors. Her eyes were the most telling thing about her, a muted green, steady and observant. The eyes of a woman who had learned that reacting too quickly gave power away. Inside the courthouse, warmth did not exist. The air was recycled, thin, humming faintly through vents like a machine breathing on its own schedule. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights that flattened everyone into the same washed-out palette. Wren's footsteps echoed softly as she walked down the long corridor toward courtroom 4C, passing rows of wooden benches, occupied by strangers clutching folders, phones, coffee cups, tissues, each one carrying a private storm. She had walked to this hallway before, 3 times in 2 weeks. Each time, she felt as if something essential had been peeled away. Today she felt hollow, but strangely lighter, as if there was nothing left for anyone to take. Courtroom 4C smelled faintly of old paper and polish. At the respondents' table, Wren sat alone. No lawyer, no briefcase, no comforting murmur of strategy. Her hands rested folded in her lap, fingers interlaced with the quiet discipline her grandmother had once taught her. If you keep your hands still, your voice will follow. Across the aisle sat Gideon Cross. Gideon was 41 and built like a man who had never been denied anything long enough for it to matter. He was tall, 6'2", maybe more, with broad shoulders shaped by private trainers and tailored discipline. His suit was charcoal gray, custom-fitted, the kind of fabric that caught the hull, light just enough to remind you how much it cost. His dark hair was combed back with meticulous care, not a strand out of place, and his beard, trimmed to designer stubble, outlined sharp cheekbones and a jaw that always looked like it was clenching something unseen. His eyes were brown, warm at first glance, but they held no depth. They reflected people rather than seeing them. Gideon leaned back in his chair, as if the courtroom were his living room. Confidence radiated from him, not loud, not aggressive, but assured in the way of a man accustomed to rooms bending around him. He smiled as Wren took her seat, a small smile meant only for her, one that said, "You are exactly where I put you." Beside him sat his attorney, Malcolm Reed, a compact man in his early 50s with thinning blonde hair and sharp, restless eyes. Malcolm had the look of someone who spoke for a living and enjoyed it far too much. His suit was expensive but utilitarian, his posture forward-leaning, as though he were always ready to strike. He whispered something into Gideon's ear. Gideon chuckled, just loud enough for Wren to hear, just quiet enough to avoid notice. Wren did not look at them again. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Evelyn Rourke entered. Judge Rourke was in her late 60s, tall, even seated, with a presence that filled the room without effort. Her hair, once auburn, had faded to iron gray and was worn in a severe bun that matched the clean lines of her black robe. Her face was carved with age and experience, not softened by either. Deep lines framed her mouth, etched by years of disappointment rather than bitterness. She had seen too much to be impressed by performance. Her eyes, dark and discerning, moved across the courtroom like searchlights. "This is the matter of Hartley versus Cross," she said, her voice level, unhurried. "Final hearing regarding dissolution of marriage, division of assets, and contested ownership of property." Her gaze paused briefly on Wren, then on Gideon. Something flickered there, interest perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Malcolm Reed rose smoothly. "Your Honor," he began, voice practiced and pleasant, "my client has acted in good faith throughout these proceedings. Mr. Cross has provided financial support, offered settlement options, and shown consistent willingness to resolve matters amicably." Gideon nodded at the right moments, expression calm, almost gracious. Wren listened, her face neutral. Each word slid past her like rain against glass. Malcolm continued. "Mrs. Hartley, however, has declined multiple reasonable offers and continues to allege misconduct without evidence. She has chosen to represent herself, which speaks to her lack of preparedness for these claims." Judge Rourke turned her attention fully to Wren. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, "is it true you are representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Wren replied. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. "And why is that?" Wren inhaled slowly. "Because my husband froze every joint account I had access to. He canceled my credit cards. He changed the locks on our home while I was at work." She paused, not for effect, but to keep her tone steady. "I could not afford legal representation." Malcolm scoffed softly. Judge Rourke raised a hand. "Continue." "He also transferred ownership of our house into his name alone," Wren said, "using forged documents, and he did the same with the registration of our dog." At that word, dog, Gideon's smile tightened. Judge Rourke glanced at the file. "The German Shepherd?" "Yes," Wren said. "His name is Bo." She saw it then, just for a moment, annoyance flicker across Gideon's face. Not anger, something colder. Bo was 4 years old, a large German shepherd with a thick sable coat and intelligent amber eyes. He had been all muscle and clumsy paws when Wren adopted him from a rescue outside Olympia. He had grown into himself quickly, standing tall and alert, ears always half forward, as if listening to something others could not hear. Bo had a scar on his left hind leg from an old injury, and a habit of leaning his weight against Wren's knee whenever he sensed her breathing change. He was not aggressive, but he was perceptive, and that had made Gideon uneasy from the start. "Do you have evidence of these claims, Mrs. Hartley?" Judge Rourke asked. Wren's fingers tightened slightly against one another. "Not with me today, Your Honor," she admitted, "but it exists." Gideon laughed then, openly, dismissively. "This is absurd," he said. "She has nothing." Judge Rourke's eyes snapped to him. "Mr. Cross," she said, voice sharp as ice, "you will remain silent unless addressed." Gideon raised his hands in mock apology, but his eyes stayed locked on Wren. The weight of the room pressed down on her. She could feel it. The skepticism, the expectation, the quiet judgment that always favored the man with representation. She had walked into this building alone, stripped of money, of credibility, of companionship. And yet, beneath the fear, something steadier remained. 3 days ago, her phone had buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I'm coming. Hold on." No signature, no explanation. But she knew. Mason, her brother, had not been part of her daily life for years. A Navy SEAL, always deployed, always somewhere unreachable. Mason Hartley was 38, tall and lean, with dark hair cut close to his scalp, and a face marked by a thin scar along his right cheek, a souvenir from a mission he never spoke about. He was quiet, not cold, but measured, as if words were tools to be used sparingly. Growing up, Mason had been the kind of boy who stood between trouble and those he loved without ever announcing himself. Something in him had hardened early, not cruelty, but resolve, after their father died, and the world demanded too much too soon. When Mason promised something, he did not dress it up. He simply did it. Wren lifted her gaze slightly now, not toward Gideon, not toward the judge, but toward the closed courtroom doors. Somewhere beyond them, rain continued to fall. Somewhere beyond them, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders through a storm was moving again. The judge cleared her throat. "We will proceed," she said. And as the hearing continued, Wren sat straighter than she had all morning, because even alone, she was no longer unguarded. By the time the judge recessed the hearing for a short break, the rain outside had thickened into a steady, unrelenting curtain. It drummed against the tall courthouse windows with quiet insistence, as if the city itself were listening in. Wren remained seated at the respondents' table long after everyone else stood. Her body felt heavy, but her mind was sharp, almost painfully alert. The exchange replayed itself again and again. The scoff in Malcolm Reed's voice, the amused curve of Gideon's mouth, the brief, unreadable pause in Judge Rourke's eyes. Nothing had shifted yet. Nothing had fallen apart. That, in itself, felt dangerous. When she finally rose, her legs protested, stiff from stillness. She moved into the hallway, where the benches were now half empty. A few people whispered into phones. Others stared at the floor like it might open and swallow them whole. Wren leaned against the wall near a vending machine, the hum of its motor oddly comforting. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant ground her in the present. That was when she felt it again. That familiar aching pull in her chest that always led back to Bo. Bo had come into her life on a gray afternoon much like this one. 4 years ago, she had driven south through rain and fog to a rescue center outside Olympia, telling herself she was just looking. She hadn't planned on choosing the largest dog there, the one everyone else seemed wary of. Bo had been almost a year old then, already big, already scarred, with a patch of fur missing near his hind leg and eyes that watched instead of begged. He had not barked when she approached. He had simply stood, steady and silent, his head tilted slightly as if measuring her. The volunteer, a young woman with cropped black hair and tired kindness in her face, had told her Bo had been returned twice. Too intense, people said, too watchful. Wren had knelt anyway, rainwater soaking through her jeans as she reached out. Bo had leaned into her hand, all 80 pounds of him, like he had finally found something solid enough to rest against. Gideon had hated that moment from the beginning. In the early days of their marriage, Gideon had been charming about it. He joked that Bo was competition, laughed when the dog positioned himself between them on the couch, teased Wren about being overly sentimental. But over time, the jokes sharpened. Gideon didn't like the way Bo tracked his movements through the room, the way the dog's ears lifted whenever Gideon's voice changed pitch. "It's just a dog," Gideon would say, irritation slipping through the polish. "Stop projecting human feelings onto it." But Bo wasn't projecting anything. He was observing. Wren opened her eyes in the hallway and stared at the far wall, where a framed photograph of Seattle's skyline hung slightly crooked. Her phone buzzed softly in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, heart stuttering for half a second before settling. No new messages. Still, she checked the unknown number again, rereading the text from 3 days ago, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more concrete. "I'm coming. Hold on." Mason had always been economical with language. Growing up, he'd been the kind of boy who listened more than he spoke, whose expression shifted only when something truly mattered. After their father's death, something in Mason had hardened, not into cruelty, but into a quiet vigilance. He watched doors. He memorized exits. He learned early that safety was something you built yourself. And now, somehow, he was building it for her. "Mrs. Hartley?" Wren turned. A woman stood a few feet away, holding a thin folder to her chest. She was in her early 40s, maybe, with sandy blonde hair pulled into a practical ponytail and a raincoat still damp at the shoulders. Her face was open, earnest, with the faint lines of someone who asked too many questions for a living. "My name is Sloan Mercer," the woman said. "I'm a freelance reporter, local." Wren stiffened instinctively. "I'm not interested in media attention." "I figured," Sloan replied quickly, raising her hand slightly in a placating gesture. "I'm not here to ambush you. I was sitting in on proceedings today. Something about this case feels off." Sloane's eyes flicked briefly toward the courtroom doors, then back to Wren. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something else. A restrained anger, perhaps, or recognition. Sloane was average height, solidly built, with the posture of someone who had learned to stand her ground in rooms that underestimated her. She had a small scar near her left eyebrow, the kind that suggested past risks taken without regret. I've covered financial misconduct cases before, Sloane continued. Men who look like your husband often hide things behind civility. If you ever want to talk off the record, I'm around. Wren studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Sloane smiled, brief and understanding. Good luck in there. She turned and disappeared down the hallway, boots squeaking softly against the floor. The bailiff called everyone back inside. When Wren returned to her seat, Gideon was already there, leaning back again, posture relaxed, one ankle resting on the opposite knee. He glanced at her, eyes scanning her face as if searching for cracks. When he found none, his smile returned, thin and self-satisfied. The hearing resumed with procedural monotony. Malcolm Reed resumed his calm dismantling of Wren's credibility, framing her claims as emotional reactions rather than facts. Gideon remained silent now, watching the judge, watching Wren, as though cataloging her every breath. Then Malcolm called his next witness. A man in his late 30s took the stand, a veterinarian named Dr. Alan Pierce. He was tall and lanky, with wire-rimmed glasses and prematurely thinning hair. His movements were careful, deliberate, the kind of man who chose precision over warmth. He testified about Beau's general health, about routine visits Gideon had scheduled, about stable conditions at the marital home. He spoke clinically, never once meeting Wren's eyes. Based on your professional assessment, Malcolm asked, would you say the dog appears well cared for under Mr. Cross's supervision? Yes, Dr. Pierce replied. From a veterinary standpoint, the environment appears appropriate. Wren felt something twist in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but grief. She wondered if Dr. Pierce had ever watched Beau press his body against her leg when Gideon's voice sharpened, or heard the low, uncertain whine Beau made when Gideon descended the basement stairs late at night. Judge Rourke thanked the witness and made a note. The judge's expression was still neutral, but there was something else now, a crease deepening between her brows, a tension in the set of her jaw. She was listening, not convinced but attentive. As proceedings dragged on, Wren felt exhaustion settle into her bones. Still, she remained upright, her posture unchanged. She had learned long ago that endurance was its own kind of defiance. When the court finally adjourned for the day, the rain outside had softened, falling in a fine mist that blurred the edges of everything. Wren exited the building slowly, the cool air brushing her face like a benediction. She pulled her coat tighter and descended the steps, each one slick and uncertain. Halfway down, her phone vibrated again. This time, the screen lit with a new message. Landed. I'm closer now. Her breath caught. She didn't reply immediately. She didn't need to. The weight in her chest eased just slightly, like a knot loosening one thread at a time. Across the city, in a modest rental on the outskirts where forest met road, Mason Hartley stood by a rain-streaked window. He was tall, broader than memory suggested, his dark hair clipped close, his beard rough from days without a razor. A faint scar traced his cheekbone. Another disappeared beneath the collar of his jacket. His eyes, steel gray, focused, watched the storm as if it were terrain to be navigated. On the table behind him lay a laptop, open to spreadsheets and documents, names and numbers mapped with the same discipline he once applied to hostile ground. He exhaled slowly, rolled his shoulders, and picked up his phone. Hold on, he murmured, not to the device, but to the idea of his sister standing alone in a room that had underestimated her. And then he turned back to the work, steady as ever. Seattle did not sleep that night. The rain thinned to a mist, but the city remained awake, streetlights glowing like tired sentinels, buses sighing at corners, ferries groaning across black water. From the edge of the city, where pavement surrendered to fir and cedar, a modest rental house sat with one light burning. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing, which was exactly why Mason Hartley had chosen it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and damp wool. Mason stood at the kitchen counter, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hands braced on either side of a laptop. He was broader than memory often allowed, lean muscle packed into a frame shaped by years of carrying weight that mattered. His beard had grown rough in the weeks since his last deployment, dark and uneven along a jaw cut sharp by discipline. The scar on his cheek caught the light when he moved, a thin, pale line earned years ago, when a door exploded inward and the world rearranged itself in smoke and sound. That day had taught him something he never forgot. Chaos favored the prepared. On the screen before him, chaos had a different shape. Numbers, transfers, Dates that almost lined up but didn't. Mason's eyes tracked the patterns the way they once tracked terrain, reading slope and shadow, anticipating where danger liked to hide. Gideon Cross had been careful, careful enough to fool auditors, careful enough to maintain the appearance of success, but not careful enough to escape someone who understood systems and pressure. Mason clicked through files methodically. Shell companies layered over one another like bad camouflage. A holding firm registered in Delaware, another in Nevada, then a private account overseas with a name that meant nothing unless you knew how to look. Gideon's mistake wasn't greed, it was confidence. He reused structures, repeated behaviors. Men like him always did. A knock sounded at the door. Mason didn't reach for anything dramatic. He simply closed the laptop halfway and turned, posture shifting subtly, balanced, ready. When he opened the door, a man stood on the threshold, rain-speckled jacket zipped to the chin. "Jonah Pike," the man said, extending a hand. "You called." Jonah Pike was in his late 40s, compact and wiry, with close-cropped hair gone almost entirely gray and a face etched by years of skepticism. He wore plain clothes, jeans, boots, a weathered jacket, but his eyes missed nothing. Once he'd been a forensic accountant for a federal task force. He'd left after a case burned him badly, choosing independence over bureaucracy. The experience had sharpened him, not softened him. Mason shook his hand. "Thanks for coming." Jonah stepped inside, glancing around with quiet appraisal. "You always live like this?" he asked, nodding toward the bare walls. "Temporary," Mason replied. Jonah smirked. "Figures?" They settled at the small kitchen table. Mason reopened the laptop, turning. It's so Jonah could see. "I need confirmation," Mason said. "Not suspicion, not probability." Jonah leaned in, fingers steepled. "Let's see what your guy's been hiding." As Jonah worked, Mason's phone buzzed on the counter. He checked it. One new message from Wren. "Still here, holding. Love you." His jaw tightened, then eased. He typed back a single line. "With you. Always." Across the city, Wren sat on the edge of a borrowed bed, the window cracked open just enough to let the rain breathe into the room. She was staying with a friend from work, Maribel Santos, a soft-spoken woman in her early 30s, with dark curls and a laugh that tried to mend things. Maribel's apartment was small but warm, filled with plants that climbed toward the light, despite Seattle's reluctance to give it. Wren stared at her phone after sending the message, thumb hovering uselessly over the screen. She felt suspended between moments, between the woman she had been and the one she was becoming. On the nightstand lay a folded photograph she hadn't looked at in years. Mason and her, standing ankle-deep in a river as children, their father's hands steadying them both. She turned the photo face down again. Some memories hurt less when they were quiet. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to Beau. She wondered if he was sleeping on the cool basement floor tonight, ears twitching at unfamiliar sounds, waiting for a voice that wasn't coming. The image lodged beneath her ribs like a splinter. Back at the rental house, Jonah exhaled sharply. "Your instincts were right," he said, swiveling the laptop slightly. "These transfers. See this sequence? He's moving money through a consulting firm that exists only on paper. Then it's split into smaller amounts and parked overseas. It's clean enough to pass a glance, dirty enough to matter." "Forgery?" Mason asked. Jonah nodded. "Likely. The signatures on the property documents, same slant, same pressure, inconsistencies. Someone practiced copying your sister's name, sloppy in the end." Mason closed his eyes for half a second. He pictured Gideon's careful smile, the way he'd lean back in court like the room belonged to him. "Can you prove it?" Jonah met his gaze. "Give me 48 hours. I'll give you a trail even a judge can't ignore." Mason stood, extending his hand again. "I appreciate it." Jonah shook it firmly. "For what it's worth," he said, pausing at the door, "men like this don't stop until someone makes them. You're doing the right thing." After Jonah left, Mason stepped outside. The rain had eased, leaving the forest breathing and alive. He stood there, letting the cold seep into his bones, grounding him. Somewhere, a dog barked, sharp, distant. Mason thought of Beau then, imagined the animal's steady presence, the way some creatures were born knowing where they belonged. Across town, Gideon Cross poured himself a drink in the penthouse he still called home. The city sprawled beneath him, lights scattered like coins across dark water. He loosened his tie, irritation humming beneath his skin. The day hadn't gone exactly as planned. The judge had listened more than he liked. The reporter in the hallway had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He sipped his whiskey and checked his phone. No messages, no alerts. He told himself everything was under control. It always had been. What he didn't see was the pattern tightening, the lines converging. He didn't hear the quiet work being done beyond his reach. In Maribel's apartment, Wren lay awake, listening to the rain fade into silence. For the first time in weeks, she felt something like structure forming beneath her fear. She didn't know the details yet. She didn't need to. She trusted the man who had promised to come. Outside, Seattle waited, patient and watchful. Morning in Seattle arrived without ceremony. The rain had retreated overnight, leaving the streets washed and reflective, as if the city had exhaled and decided to watch what came next. Clouds hung low, heavy but undecided, and a pale light slid between buildings like a cautious guest. For Wren Hartley, the quiet felt louder than the storm. She stood at Maribel's kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Maribel moved around behind her, careful not to crowd, her soft slippers whispering across the floor. There was kindness in Maribel's restraint. She knew when to ask and when to simply exist nearby. Wren appreciated that more than she could explain. "Court again tomorrow?" Maribel asked gently. Wren nodded. "Yes." Maribel tilted her head, studying Wren's reflection in the window. "You look steadier," she said. "Not better, just steadier." Wren managed a small smile. "I think that's all I can ask for, right? Now." Across the city, Gideon Cross woke in a different kind of quiet. His penthouse was immaculate, all glass and steel and curated emptiness. The kind of place designed to impress visitors and intimidate silence. Gideon shaved with precise strokes, studying his reflection as if it were a rival. The faint line between his brows had deepened since the hearing. He didn't like variables. He didn't like being watched. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He frowned and answered. "Yes?" "Mr. Cross," a woman's voice said, brisk and professional. "This is Hannah Lee. I'm a process server." The razor paused mid-stroke. "You've been served," Hannah continued calmly, unfazed by his silence. "Documents regarding financial disclosure and asset verification. You'll find them with your doorman." The line went dead. Gideon stared at his reflection, the mask slipping just enough to reveal irritation beneath. Hannah Lee was someone he hadn't anticipated. She was in her early 30s, efficient and unassuming, with straight black hair cut to her shoulders and an expression that suggested she had learned early not to be intimidated by wealth. She'd grown up watching her parents lose a small business to a man who smiled while signing the paperwork. Since then, she took quiet satisfaction in delivering consequences. Gideon rinsed the razor and set it down. 48 hours, he thought. Something had shifted. He didn't know what yet, but he could feel the pressure building, subtle and insistent, like a headache that refused to be ignored. On the outskirts of the city, Mason Hartley sat in the rental house with Jonah Pike, the table between them now cluttered with printed pages and handwritten notes. Jonah looked more animated than before, his skepticism sharpened into focus. "There's more," Jonah said, tapping a document. "Your guy didn't just forge signatures. He rerouted payments through a shell that lists animal welfare consulting as a front. It's thin, but it's there." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Animal welfare?" Jonah nodded. "Tax advantages, easy cover. Most people don't scrutinize it." Mason leaned back, exhaling slowly. The thought of Gideon using anything resembling compassion as camouflage made his jaw tighten. He pictured Bo again, steady, watchful, incapable of deceit. "That could tie directly to the dog," Mason said. "Custody, expenses, registration." "Exactly," Jonah replied. "And it gives your sister leverage." Mason stood and paced, boots soft against the floor. Years ago, on a mission that went sideways in a narrow valley overseas, he'd learned how pressure revealed truth. Push in the right place at the right time, and the structure failed. Gideon was a structure built on repetition and arrogance. Mason just needed the right angle. That afternoon, Wren took the bus across town, raincoat pulled tight, her mind fixed on a single goal. She got off near a quiet industrial stretch where the city thinned and sounds carried farther. A low building sat behind a chain-link fence, modest and clean. A sign read, "Evergreen Canine Boarding." Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and wet fur. A man approached from the back, late 50s, broad in the shoulders, with a salt and pepper beard that framed a face weathered by years outdoors. His name was Russell Russ Halvorsen, and he walked with the careful ease of someone who'd learned patience from animals rather than people. "Can I help you?" Russ asked. "I'm here about a German shepherd," Wren said. "Bo." Russ's expression shifted. Subtle but unmistakable, recognition mixed with hesitation. "He's here," Russ said slowly. "Boarded by Mr. Cross." Wren swallowed. "Can I see him?" Russ studied her face for a long moment. He was a practical man, not unkind, but cautious. Years ago, he'd lost a dog to an abusive owner because paperwork favored the wrong person. The memory had carved a permanent crease between his eyes. "I'm not supposed to," he said, but he sighed. "Follow me." Bo's kennel was clean, larger than Wren had feared, but still wrong. Too quiet, too confined. When he saw her, his ears lifted instantly, his entire body stilled. Then he surged forward, tail sweeping the air, a low sound escaping his chest. Not a bark, but something closer to relief. Wren knelt, fingers curling through the wire. Bo pressed his muzzle against her hand, eyes bright and unblinking. He was thinner than she remembered, his coat duller, but his presence was unchanged, solid, anchoring. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm working on it." Russ watched from a respectful distance, his jaw set. "He waits like that all day," he said quietly. "Doesn't make a fuss, just watches the door." Wren closed her eyes. "Thank you for letting me see him." As she left, Russ handed her a small envelope. "These are logs," he said. "Feeding, visits, who drops by. I don't know if it helps." "It does," Wren said, gripping the envelope like a lifeline. That evening, Mason listened as Wren told him about Bo, about the logs, about Russ's quiet decency. Mason didn't interrupt. He rarely did. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. "He's strong," Mason said finally. "So are you." She laughed softly, the sound breaking and mending something all at once. Across the city, Gideon paced his living room, documents spread across the glass table. The process server's notice lay open, stark and unavoidable. He poured another drink, the confidence he wore like armor beginning to crack. He didn't know about Russ. He didn't know about Jonah. He didn't know how close the walls were. Outside, Seattle watched, patient as ever. Seattle turned brittle the next morning. The clouds lifted just enough to let the cold settle in, a dry chill that crept into bones and sharpened edges. Wren felt it as she walked from the bus stop to the courthouse, her coat buttoned high, her breath a pale ghost ahead of her. The city looked cleaner in daylight, almost forgiving, but she knew better now. Forgiveness here came late, if at all. Inside courtroom 4C, the air held a faint static, as though the room anticipated conflict. Gideon Cross arrived early. He stood near the counsel table, jacket off, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms dusted with dark hair, and a watch that cost more than some people's rent. The beard he usually kept meticulously groomed showed a hint of unevenness this morning. It was a small thing, but it betrayed him. Gideon did not like being rushed. Malcolm Reed leaned in close, whispering with a tight urgency that contrasted with his usual smooth cadence. Malcolm's eyes darted toward the bench, then back, to Gideon. Something had changed overnight. The disclosure notice sat heavy between them, like an accusation with teeth. Wren took her seat alone again, but she did not feel alone in the same way. The envelope from Russ Halvorsen rested inside her bag, the boarding logs carefully folded. Her posture was steady, chin level, eyes forward. She thought of Bo waiting, patient as a stone. She thought of Mason working somewhere beyond the glass and stone and law. Judge Evelyn Rourke entered, took her seat, and surveyed the room. "We'll continue," she said. "Mr. Reed," Malcolm stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, my client would like to enter a motion concerning the respondent's conduct." Wren's pulse ticked upward, but she did not move. Malcolm continued, voice measured. "We have reason to believe Mrs. Hartley has attempted to interfere with custodial arrangements regarding the dog by contacting third parties without authorization." Gideon glanced at Wren then, the faintest curl of satisfaction touching his mouth. Wren rose. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I requested to see my dog at a licensed boarding facility. I did not remove him. I did not interfere." Judge Rourke's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Reed," she said, "do you have evidence of interference?" Malcolm hesitated, just long enough to matter. "Not at this time." "Then we proceed," the judge replied. The motion died where it stood, but Gideon's eyes stayed on Wren, assessing, recalibrating. He had tried to press a weak point and found resistance instead. After the session adjourned, Wren stepped into the hallway and felt the shift immediately. The air was heavier, conversations hushed. She sensed eyes on her back. Halfway to the exit, a man fell into step beside her. "Mrs. Hartley," he said quietly. She stopped. The man was in his late 30s, tall but narrow, with a sharp nose and eyes set too close together. His hair was dark and thinning at the temples, his beard trimmed to a severe line that accentuated a jaw clenched by habit. He wore a gray blazer that didn't quite fit, and shoes polished beyond necessity. "My name's Victor Hale," he said, producing a card without touching her. "Private investigator. I work for Mr. Cross." Wren's jaw set. "I don't wish to speak with you." Victor smiled without warmth. "I imagine you don't. I'm just here to advise you to reconsider certain explorations. People get hurt when lines blur." "What kind of people?" Wren asked. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward the exit, where Gideon stood talking to Malcolm. "The kind without resources." Wren held his gaze. "Is that a threat?" Victor shrugged. "A caution." She stepped past him without another word. Her legs carried her forward, but her hands shook once she reached the steps outside. She breathed through it, slow and deliberate, until the tremor passed. Across town, Mason Hartley watched a different kind of line blur. He sat in the passenger seat of a nondescript sedan, Jonah Pike at the wheel. Rain spotted the windshield, light and intermittent. "Victor Hale," Jonah said. "I know the type. Ex-cop, fired after an internal review, excessive force, questionable interrogations. He works the edges, likes intimidation more than evidence." Mason nodded. "He won't stop." "No," Jonah agreed. "Men like that escalate." They followed the sedan Victor drove as it peeled away from the courthouse. Not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to lose him. Mason's posture was relaxed, but his eyes tracked everything. Reflections, mirrors, angles. Years ago, a convoy ambush had taught him the cost of distraction. He did not repeat lessons. Victor stopped at a cafe near the waterfront. Mason and Jonah parked a block away. They waited. Patience was Mason's sharpest tool. Inside the cafe, Victor met with another man, older, heavier, with a permanent flush in his cheeks and hands that trembled as he lifted his cup. This was Dennis Rowe, a compliance manager at Gideon's firm. He had the look of someone who lived in constant apology. Mason recognized it. Guilt aged people quickly. Jonah lifted his camera, snapping photos through the rain-streaked glass. "That's interesting," he murmured. "Leverage," Mason said, "or panic." Back at Maribel's apartment, Wren found Sloane Mercer waiting in the stairwell, notebook tucked under her arm. Sloane's hair was damp, her jacket creased from long hours. "I heard about the PI," Sloane said quietly. "Word travels." Wren studied her. "How?" "Victor Hale doesn't exactly keep a low profile," Sloane replied. "I've been digging into Cross's firm. There's chatter. People are nervous." Wren hesitated. "I don't want this to become a spectacle." Sloane nodded. "Then let's keep it factual, clean. You give me what you can. I verify. I don't print without proof." Wren thought of the logs in her bag, of Russ's careful handwriting. "I may have something soon," she said. That night, Gideon Cross poured himself another drink and stared out at the city. The confidence he wore like a tailored coat felt tighter now, restrictive. Victor had reported the contact. Malcolm had warned him about disclosure timelines. The judge's eyes lingered longer than Gideon liked. He dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "I need reassurance," he said when the call connected. "Now." The voice on the other end was calm, distant. "Reassurance costs more when the weather changes." Gideon hung up without replying. On the edge of the city, Mason stood beneath a streetlight and made a call of his own. "Don't engage him," he told Wren softly. "Document everything. I've got eyes on the rest." She exhaled, the sound shaky but relieved. "Thank you." "Hold steady," Mason said. "Pressure makes people show their seams." As the night deepened, Seattle settled into a watchful quiet. Lines had been drawn, moves made. The board was changing, piece by piece, and for the first time Gideon Cross was reacting instead of directing. The rain returned at dawn, lighter than before but more persistent, a fine gray veil that softened Seattle's edges without forgiving them. It clung to street signs and soaked into brick, seeping quietly into places no one thought to guard. For Wren Hartley, the morning carried a strange duality, exhaustion woven tightly with resolve. She felt it as she dressed, button by button, choosing clothing not for protection, but for clarity. Today mattered, not because something would end, but because something had begun to surface. Courtroom 4C filled slowly. The mood had shifted since the last session. It no longer felt like a formality, but a test. People sensed it. Even the bailiff moved with a sharper awareness, eyes tracking entrances and exits. Gideon Cross arrived late this time, jaw tight, suit immaculate, but worn like armor rather than comfort. The faint arrogance he once carried so effortlessly had been replaced by vigilance. His beard was freshly trimmed again, a deliberate correction, but his eyes betrayed sleep lost to calculation. Malcolm Reed followed him in, quieter than usual, his folder thicker, his steps measured. He glanced once toward Wren, then away. He knew the ground beneath them was less stable now. Wren sat, hands folded, posture calm. Inside her bag were copies of the kennel logs Russ Halverson had given her, neatly organized, edges smoothed as if care alone could lend them weight. She did not know yet when or how they would be used. Only that truth often arrived from directions no one bothered to block. Judge Evelyn Rourke entered promptly and wasted no time. "We'll hear additional testimony today," she said. "Proceed." Malcolm stood first, calling a witness to reinforce Gideon's position. Another professional, another voice meant to stabilize the narrative, but the rhythm faltered. The judge's questions cut closer now, her attention sharpened by inconsistencies that had begun to stack like uneven bricks. When Malcolm finished, Judge Rourke turned her gaze to Wren. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, "do you wish to present anything at this time?" Wren stood. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of quiet urgency beneath it. "Yes, Your Honor, I would like to submit supplemental documentation regarding my dog's care and custody." Malcolm objected automatically, but the judge lifted a hand. "I'll allow it." Wren stepped forward, passing the documents to the clerk. She did not dramatize them. She simply let them exist. Feeding logs, visit records, notes written in a careful, consistent hand. The judge scanned the pages, her brow furrowing. "These indicate restricted visitation," Judge Rourke said, looking up, "and irregular access." "They reflect the reality," Wren replied, "not the intention." Gideon shifted in his seat. The movement was small, but Mason Hartley noticed it from the back of the courtroom. He had arrived quietly that morning, blending into the row of observers, his presence unannounced. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, his beard trimmed shorter now, his hair still clipped close. The lines of his face were sharper in daylight, the scars more visible, marks of a life shaped by consequences. He did not look at Gideon directly. He watched the room instead, reading posture and tension, the way others read words. Beside him sat Jonah Pike, notebook resting on his knee, pen moving sparingly. Jonah's skepticism had given way to precision. He was cataloging reactions now, not documents. The judge recessed briefly to review the materials. In the hallway, Wren felt the pressure return, heavier this time. She leaned against the wall, breathing slowly, when a voice spoke behind her. "Mrs. Hartley." She turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, mid-50s, tall, with silver blonde hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Her clothes were practical, understated. Her face held the kind of composure that came from having learned restraint the hard way. She carried herself like someone accustomed to being overlooked, and who had learned to use that to her advantage. "My name is Elaine Porter," the woman said. "I used to work for Mr. Cross." Wren's breath caught. "In what capacity?" "Administrative oversight," Elaine replied. "I kept schedules, managed internal records, cleaned up messes." There was no bitterness in her tone, only fatigue. Elaine's hands were clasped in front of her, fingers marked by faint ink stains that spoke of years spent correcting others' mistakes. She had left Gideon's firm 6 months earlier, after a confrontation that had ended with a severance agreement and a warning disguised as kindness. "I shouldn't be talking to you," Elaine continued, "but I've been watching this case, and I recognize patterns." Wren studied her carefully. "Why come forward now?" Elaine's lips pressed together. "Because I have a dog, too," she said simply, "and because I've spent too long being quiet." She slipped a folded envelope into Wren's hand. "These are copies, meeting notes, directives that never made it into official files. I can't testify yet, but you'll need this." Before Wren could respond, Elaine turned and walked away, disappearing into the flow of people, as if she had never been there. Mason watched it all from a distance, eyes narrowing slightly. Unexpected witnesses were often the most valuable and the most fragile. When court resumed, the atmosphere had thickened. Gideon sat rigid now, his confidence stripped down to calculation. Judge Rourke addressed the room with measured gravity. "I will be calling additional witnesses in the coming sessions," she said. "This matter has expanded beyond simple custody and division. Counsel should prepare accordingly." Gideon's jaw clenched. Malcolm leaned in, whispering urgently. That evening, Mason and Wren met briefly outside the courthouse. The rain had stopped again, leaving the air cold and clean. Mason stood close, not touching, his presence a solid line against the chaos. "You okay?" he asked. Wren nodded. Someone came forward. Mason's gaze sharpened. "Who?" "Elaine Porter, former employee." She handed him the envelope. Mason scanned the contents quickly, then looked up, a flicker of something like approval crossing his face. "This is good," he said. "Risky, but good." "Will it hold?" Wren asked. Mason met her eyes. "Truth usually does," he said. "Eventually." Across the city, Gideon Cross stood alone in his penthouse, city lights blurring beyond the glass. His phone buzzed again, another missed call, another reminder that control was slipping. He poured a drink, but his hand shook just enough to spill a drop onto the counter. Somewhere, lines were crossing that he could no longer redraw, and Seattle, patient as ever, held its breath. Seattle woke under a brittle blue sky that felt borrowed, as if the city had stepped briefly into someone else's weather. The rain had retreated, leaving behind air so clear it sharpened outlines and made distance deceptive. Wren Hartley noticed it as she crossed the plaza toward the courthouse. The way sound traveled farther, the way her footsteps seemed louder than usual. Days like this did not forgive mistakes. They remembered them. Inside courtroom 4C, the seats filled early. The low murmur carried a different texture now, less routine, more anticipation. Judge Evelyn Rourke took her seat with the quiet gravity of someone prepared to draw lines that would not be redrawn. Gideon Cross arrived on time, his suit impeccable, his posture corrected to the last degree. The beard was trimmed perfectly again, a defensive gesture masquerading as control. His eyes, however, betrayed a restless calculation, darting once toward the back of the room before settling forward. Mason Hartley sat. Among the observers, still unannounced, his presence understated but immovable. He wore a dark jacket zipped to mid-chest, his shoulders squared, his hands relaxed on his thighs. The scars on his face were more visible in the clear light, evidence of a life that had demanded decisiveness. Years earlier, on a mission gone wrong in a desert that offered no cover, Mason had learned the cost of hesitation. Since then, he trusted preparation and timing above all else. Jonah Pike sat beside him, notebook closed now. Today was not for notes. Today was for listening. Judge Rourke opened proceedings with a measured tone. "We will hear from additional witnesses today," she said. "The court has reviewed supplemental materials submitted by the respondent. Counsel will proceed accordingly." Malcolm Reed rose, the edges of his confidence dulled. He called his first witness quickly, efficiently, as if trying to outrun something unseen. The testimony landed flat, its purpose obvious and its substance thin. Judge Rourke's questions cut through it with surgical precision. Then the judge did something unexpected. "Ms. Porter," she said, eyes lifting toward the gallery, "please come forward." A ripple moved through the room. Elaine Porter stood from the back row, smoothing the front of her cardigan with steady hands. She was composed, but there was a tightness in her shoulders that spoke of long-held restraint. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back neatly, her posture erect without stiffness. She walked to the stand like someone who had rehearsed the path in her mind 100 times, preparing for the moment she would finally take it. Elaine raised her right hand, was sworn in, and took her seat. "State your name and former position for the record," Judge Rourke said. "Elaine Porter," she replied. Her voice was even, practiced from years of measured speech. "I served as Administrative Oversight Manager at Cross Financial Group for 12 years. Malcolm stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we object. Ms. Porter is not on the witness list." "She is now," Judge Rourke replied calmly. "Proceed." Elaine's gaze never touched Gideon as she spoke. She addressed the judge, the room, the truth. She described directives that bypassed standard review, documents flagged and then quietly removed, meetings held without minutes, and decisions made without accountability. She explained how Gideon Cross cultivated silence, not through overt threats, but through implication, through reward and isolation. Did these practices extend to personal matters? Judge Rourke asked. Elaine hesitated, then nodded. Yes, including the handling of property and assets connected to his marriage. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm attempted to regain footing. Ms. Porter, isn't it true you left the company under a severance agreement? Yes, Elaine said, after I refused to alter records. And you expect us to believe this testimony is unbiased? Elaine met his eyes then, her expression unwavering. I expect you to believe it because it's accurate. Judge Rourke leaned forward slightly. Ms. Porter, she said, did you observe any documentation relating to the dog in question? Elaine nodded once. Yes. Expense routing under a shell designation. Veterinary charges and boarding fees categorized for tax advantage. Gideon's jaw tightened. The movement was sharp enough that Mason felt it from across the room, a tension like a wire pulled too far. The judge recessed briefly, the room exhaling in unison. In the hallway, Wren stood near the window, sunlight spilling across the floor in clean lines. Elaine approached her quietly. I won't stay long, Elaine said. I've done what I came to do. Wren nodded. Thank you. Elaine hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, your dog never stopped being used as leverage. That bothered me more than the money. Before Wren could respond, Elaine turned and walked away, shoulders lighter than when she had arrived. When court resumed, Judge Rourke addressed Gideon directly. Mr. Cross, she said, you will answer the court's questions. Gideon stood. His movements were controlled, but the strain showed now at the corners of his eyes. Yes, Your Honor. Did you authorize the categorization of personal expenses under corporate designations? No. Did you direct the alteration or removal of records related to marital assets? No. Judge Rourke studied him for a long moment. Did you restrict your spouse's access to property, finances, and her dog as a means of coercion? Gideon's lips pressed together. Absolutely not. At the back of the room, Mason shifted slightly. Jonah glanced at him, a question in his eyes. Mason nodded once. The clerk received a small device from the bailiff and handed it to the judge. Judge Rourke looked at it, then at Gideon. We have obtained an audio recording submitted with supplemental materials, she said. The court will listen. The sound that filled the room was unmistakable. Gideon's voice, low and controlled, speaking to someone just out of frame. The words were measured, but the intent was not. He spoke of leverage, of compliance, of consequences. He mentioned the dog, not by name, but by function. Silence followed, heavy and unyielding. Gideon opened his mouth, then closed it. His composure fractured, not dramatically, but enough. The armor cracked. Judge Rourke removed her glasses and set them down with deliberate care. This court does not look kindly on coercion, she said, nor on deception. She glanced toward Wren, then back to Gideon. We will proceed to final determinations in the next session. Outside, the sky had shifted again, clouds gathering at the edges of the blue. Wren stood on the courthouse steps with Mason beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was unmistakable, solid. It's breaking, he said quietly. Wren nodded, her eyes on the horizon. I can feel it. Across the city, Gideon Cross stood alone in his penthouse, the recording echoing in his mind. He stared at his reflection in the glass, at the man he had carefully assembled over years of control. For the first time, he did not recognize him. Seattle waited, patient as ever, as the seam split wide enough for the truth to pass through. Seattle greeted the final morning with rain again, as if the city refused to let the story end without reminding everyone where it began. The sky was low and iron-colored, clouds pressed together like a held breath. Water slid along the courthouse steps in thin, shining veins, tracing paths that disappeared before they reached the street. It was the kind of weather that stripped things down to their essentials. Wren Hartley stood beneath the awning, hands folded at her waist, feeling neither fear nor anticipation, only a deep, steady readiness. She wore the same navy coat she had worn on the first day, but it fit differently on her shoulders. Or perhaps she carried it differently. The weight she bore was no longer one-sided. Mason stood a step behind her, slightly to the side, close enough to be felt without intruding. His beard was neatly trimmed again, his jacket clean, his posture relaxed but alert. Years of service had taught him when vigilance was no longer required, but habit remained. He scanned the perimeter once, then let his gaze rest on his sister. There were no words needed. This was her moment. Inside courtroom 4C, the air felt charged, as if the room itself understood finality. The benches were full. Sloane Mercer sat near the aisle, notebook closed for once, her eyes lifted from the page to the people. She was not here as a reporter today. She was here as a witness to something that mattered. Gideon Cross entered last. He looked thinner, not physically diminished, but pared down, the polish no longer hiding the strain beneath. His suit was still impeccable, but it wore him now instead of the other way around. The beard was perfectly groomed, the hair slicked back with precision, yet his eyes were hollowed by nights without rest. He no longer leaned back in his chair. He sat upright, hands clasped, knuckles pale. Malcolm Reed took his place beside him, face set in a professional mask that no longer reached his eyes. The man had built his career on winning, not on defending the indefensible. Today he understood the difference. Judge Evelyn Rourke entered, robes settling around her like a final word. She surveyed the room, her expression calm but resolute. This was not a day for ambiguity. "We are here to conclude the matter of Hartley versus Cross," she said. "The court has reviewed all submitted evidence, testimony, and supplemental materials." The room fell utterly silent. Judge Rourke spoke without flourish. Her words were precise, deliberate, and irreversible. She outlined the findings: financial coercion, document manipulation, misuse of corporate structures for personal leverage, and the deliberate restriction of access to marital property, including a living being used as control. "Mr. Cross," she said, looking directly at Gideon, "this court finds your conduct not only unethical but harmful." Gideon opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Whatever defense remained had nowhere left to stand. Judge Rourke turned her gaze to Wren. "Mrs. Hartley, this court awards you full legal ownership of the marital residence, immediate restoration of access to all joint assets pending audit, and sole custody of the dog, Bo." The word landed softly, like something finally set down. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Wren felt her breath catch, then release. Her hands trembled once before stilling. She did not cry, not yet. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging something she had always known was hers. Judge Rourke continued, "Furthermore, this court issues a permanent protective order. Mr. Cross is prohibited from contact, direct or indirect." She paused, then added, "This matter will be referred for further investigation as warranted." The gavel struck once, clean, final. Gideon sat frozen for a moment longer, as if waiting for the world to correct itself. When it didn't, he stood abruptly, chair scraping back. His eyes flicked to Wren, not with anger now, but something closer to disbelief. Mason stepped forward then, not aggressively, simply occupying space. Gideon's gaze faltered. He turned and walked out, escorted by his attorney, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the hall. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. The drive to Evergreen Canine Boarding felt unreal, as if the city had rearranged itself overnight. Wren sat in the passenger seat, fingers laced tightly together, staring out at streets she had walked 100 times without ever seeing this version of them. Mason drove with one hand on the wheel, steady and unhurried. Russ Halverson met them at the gate. He looked relieved when he saw Wren, his weathered face creasing into a smile that reached his eyes. "He's been waiting," Russ said simply. Bo emerged the moment the kennel door opened. He was thinner, his coat still a little dull, but the instant he saw Wren, everything else vanished. His ears snapped forward, his body coiled, and then he was there. Weight, warmth, life, pressing into her, tail sweeping the air in wild arcs. A sound tore out of her chest, half laugh, half sob, as she dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. Bo leaned into her with everything he had, muzzle pressed against her shoulder, breath hot and real and alive. "I'm here," she whispered into his fur. "I'm not going anywhere." Bo whined softly, then stilled, as if some internal alarm had finally been shut off. Russ watched from a respectful distance, wiping his hands on his jacket. "He'll need a little time," he said, "but he's strong." "So am I," Wren replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. 3 weeks later, the house felt like a home again. The locks were changed, the rooms aired out. Light moved freely through spaces that had once felt guarded. Sloane published a careful, factual piece that avoided spectacle but left no doubt. Jonah Pike's findings found their way to the right, desks. Elaine Porter disappeared quietly back into her life, lighter for having spoken. Mason stayed longer than he planned. He fixed a loose stair rail, installed better lighting, walked Bo every morning at dawn, the two of them moving in companionable silence through wet streets. Bo followed him with quiet respect, recognizing something familiar in the man's bearing, a protector, not a master. On the morning Mason left, the rain finally stopped. Wren stood on the porch, Bo at her side, as Mason slung his bag over his shoulder. He hesitated, then pulled her into a brief, firm embrace. "You held," he said. She smiled. "You came." He nodded once. That was enough. As his car disappeared down the street, Wren turned back to the house. Bo followed, settling at her feet as sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The world did not feel perfect, but it felt possible, and for the first time in a long while, that was more than enough. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes, they come quietly, through a door that finally opens, through a truth that refuses to stay buried, through a hand that reaches out when you thought no one was coming. This story reminds us of something simple yet sacred. God does not forget the broken, the silenced, or the ones who wait in the dark. Even when the world turns away, even when justice feels delayed, He is still working, often behind the scenes, often through ordinary people, and sometimes through the quiet loyalty of a dog who never stops believing. In our everyday lives, we may not stand in courtrooms or face headlines, but we all know what it means to feel trapped, unseen, or afraid. And maybe this story is your reminder that help can arrive late, but never too late, that second chances are real, and that faith, when held gently and patiently, still moves mountains. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may be losing hope. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or share a moment when you felt God show up for you in a quiet way. Please subscribe to the channel if you believe stories like this matter, stories that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you and your family. May He protect the children, the animals, and every soul who feels forgotten tonight. And may your home be filled with peace, strength, and the soft light of hope.